Chapter 3 The Body Thief. The shards of will shall gather anew the faces of the unseen hungers. The serpent rises with the storm, the wolf long forgotten stirs. Dread them, for they herald the end. The first Delcat. Prophecy of Signad, year 312. The pendant of wood around the dead girl's neck split down the center. It unfurled its long twig-like legs and rose, its little head jerking from side to side. It nibbled at the chain, breaking the link between its body and the corpse. Then it rushed into the wound in the body's chest, emerging a moment later, glowing with a faint golden light, stained red with blood. The Greys had long since left, leaving their wounded and dead. The 4 bodies lay in the mud, one killed by the Guardian, the 5th was mortally wounded, but not dead, not yet. One of the Alcuers who had been felled, a woman, her mask discarded, had managed to pull herself further from the clearing in the blistering heat that was the burning wreckage of the starship. Still, she put one hand in front of the other, her cloak dragged through filth as she wheezed painful breaths. The Grey didn't notice the pendant as it skittered over the ground, turning towards her as it found what it was seeking. The woman turned at the last moment, spotting the thing, raising her hand with widening eyes before it jumped, darting up her nose. The woman fell back, screaming and gagging, clawing at her face as blood began to flood from her nostrils and then from her ears. The Grey began to convulse as her eyes rolled back into her head, then lay still. The woman began to change. 5 bodies lay in the mud. The clouds had broken and the cold sun shone onto the field of black obsidian. The charred ribs of the ship lay against a blue sky. The pack doll lay slain at the edge of the clearing. Large black birds pecked at the corpses, tearing pieces from their bloating bodies. A black cat stood on one of the bodies and hissed, and the bird hopped away with a taunting caw. A second hopped closer, risking the feline's wrath, pecking experimentally at the body's shoe. The shoe twitched. The bird cocked its head. Sule sat up and screamed. The carrion birds fled into the sky, crying in surprise. Sule felt as cold as ice. Beyond shivering, beyond feeling, everything ached. She blinked, shivering violently, her breaths coming fast and hard as she looked to her right. A girl lay in the mud. A girl with her face. Her face. The small pale scar on the chin from falling out of a tree. The unruly brown hair matted with blood. The torn cloak Ansel had shoddily mended for her the night before. Her own lifeless eyes stared back at her. "What are you?" Sule cried out, scrambling backwards until her hands touched something soft and cold. She turned to see Vada's gutted throat. Then she turned again and saw the body she knew was Ansel laying still, face down in the mud. Now dried pieces of him, torn and missing. The smell, oh gods, the smell. Like putrid yellow of sick snot bursting in her head. Sule started to scream again, but then stopped, leaned over, and retched. When she looked up from the mess, it all came rushing back. How long had it been? Days? Her breaths came faster until she felt dizzy. Sule crawled forwards to make sure what she was seeing was real. She reached out and touched the body that was her. At least it had her face. Its skin was smooth, stiff, and cold. Sule moved her fingers to the sword wound at the center of the chest, right at the heart. Was it her? Then if it was her, then what was she? She dared to look at her hands. They were her hands, weren't they? No. The fingers were longer, the knuckles leaner. Trembling, she brought a hand to her face. The shape of her jaw felt subtly wrong. Her hair, when she grabbed a fistful, wasn't the thick, coarse brown she knew. It was softer, thinner. Her clothes were wrong. Sule brought a hand to her own chest. She could still feel the ache where the sword had pierced her, but she was still very much alive, and she could feel her heart beating. She stumbled to the edge of a puddle and stared at her reflection. The face was subtly older, sharper, and paler, and the eyes. Her eyes were a dark brown, but these were green? Gray? She couldn't tell. It was mixed. Parts of her were her, but except what? Sule touched her cheeks. What was happening to her? Sule sank to the ground, her knees drawn to her chest next to Ansel's body. She sobbed, cradling his head in her arms. Ansel had protected her, and he died for it, but why? She was nothing. She was worse than nothing. She shouldn't matter to anyone. Small birds flitted among the rocks, chirping sweetly. A breeze swept into a little leaf twister, dancing between two boulders. After a time, she stood stiffly and steadied herself. Sule tried not to think too much about the prior owner of her new clothes. She decided to take the clothes from her old body. She tried not to think about it as a shed skin. Sule dropped the gray cloak and threw the buckles into the ground in fury. She tried to pull on her old cloak, and then stared with horror as she realized it was too small, and that it wasn't the cloak that had shrunk. She'd gotten taller. Was she some kind of monster? A body-snatching monster from somewhere in the deep? Like the stories mothers told their children to scare them. Maybe Dadden had been right all along. Sule gulped. No, of course not. There was a reasonable explanation for this. People woke up from the dead all the time, especially wearing other people's clothes. It was completely normal. Nothing to see here. Nothing at all. Everything was fine. It was fine. Everything was... Sule began to laugh. Little hiccups of madness that turned into sobs. She walked to a rock and sat against it for a while longer. What could she do? The only family she had ever known were Ansel and Vada. Her parents... Sule suddenly stopped and became perfectly still. She stared out between her fingers. Could that have been a lie as well? He'd said her parents had died in a mining accident, but he'd never gone into detail. Could her parents still be alive? Maybe they were the people she had to meet on this rose he'd mentioned. Sule couldn't be sure now because Ansel had lied. By the 9, he'd never been real. He'd lied about everything. She didn't believe him. He was an Alcure. Correction. She looked at the corpse. Had been an Alcure. Oh, my Enoch's pearls. Her head was pounding. She could barely think. Sule massaged her temples. He'd told her to go to the rose. She assumed it was a place and not a plant. Why would he have her go searching for a flower? She would have to go to the city, find a way to the rose. Then, well, she'd figure it out when she got there. She had to be sure. She had to know the whole truth. It was better than staying here to die. Again? Sule shuddered. She saw a glint of metal in the dried mud as she climbed to her feet. It was the dagger Ansel had given her, the same one Vada had held to her throat, with a bronze hilt and a silver blade. She rubbed her thumb across an inscription etched into the surface. Necessity carves the path to truth. Sule slipped it into her belt, failing to feel any safer. She did find a single coin, a dunny, barely enough to buy a slice of bread. Sule looked elsewhere for the pendant Ansel had given her, the only thing she'd ever known that belonged to her parents. But all she found was a silver chain. The Greys had spared nothing. Sule dragged Ansel's body to a makeshift pyre she'd constructed from the bits of wood she'd managed to find amongst the rocks, then went and retrieved a hot coal from the charred skeleton of the ship, placing it in a bundle of dried grass in the closed cup of her palms. She coaxed it to life, blowing on it gently. In a moment she watched the flames leap up toward the deep. She wondered which of the embers were his soul. "I'm sorry," she said to the remaining bodies. "There weren't enough sticks." She thought she might cry again, but she didn't. Sule left them there, baking in the mud for the birds. Would they mind? Surely they'd understand. The cat and the dog watched the girl trudge across the barren flats from their perch on a mossy rock, dark oil running from their bodies to form a little moat. "She survived," said Olna, licking a paw. "The general was careless," said Jesper. "He'll be back," said Olna as the cat stretched, its back arching into the air, the golden eyes blinking sleepily. "She's going to the town," said Jesper, a low growl building in the hound's throat. "She may not make it to the city before he realizes." Olna hopped into the grass with a splash of ink. The eyes floated above the dark abyss pooling at its feet. The cat might have been grinning. "There's still time," said Olna with a purr. The acrid stench of smoke filled Sule's nose as she halted in a patch of grass. She went to her hands and knees and crawled the rest of the way to where the light filtered through the stalks, illuminating the damp moss that pressed softly against her skin. She nearly cried out in dismay, but bit her lip and whispered instead, "No." Where the town had been, there remained only a smoking crater ringed by a shiny stain of red, which Sule realized was glass formed from the melted mud. What lightning could do such a thing? Steam hissed and spit around the rim where the rainwater touched. It climbed into the sky to form a rolling column of white smoke. She lay there for a time, mesmerized, staring at the pit of death. Sule finally stirred. It was a risk to stay here longer, but her killers thought her dead, and then perhaps they had missed the cabin. There was a brief spark of hope as she thought of home, one that she quickly pushed down even as she turned to wander off in the direction of the hills. As the terrible heat in the air from the crater faded behind her, her breath began to gather in a cloud before her lips. She'd see the first frost on the ground tonight. Sule crept up the hill and stopped short of the clearing. She peered over a rock, watching the door and the darkened windows. The cabin stood intact and empty, and she didn't trust it in the slightest. Sule had just come out from cover when she heard the murmur of voices rising up from the valley path behind her. In a panic, she darted forwards, across the open yard and the small herb garden, concealing herself behind a rickety shed. The voices became louder, angry, and Sule found that she knew them. They were the townspeople, Toldrimites making their way up to her home. Sule pressed her back against the wood, the chill of the air biting at her nose, which ran red as she wiped it with her sleeve. "Where are all the devils?" yelled a man. "It looks empty." "He has taken them. He has exacted justice." "Who knows what demons lurk inside?" said another. "I say we burn it, lest the Lord's messengers return from the sky and mistake it as a heretical shrine." "We all heard the Lord's message. We must repent. We have paid, now we must show our loyalty." "Hear, hear," cried a chorus of voices amidst the cries and sobs of fear. Sule bit her lip. What were they talking about? She saw a crowd through the crack in the slats, and her stomach dropped as a torch was flung through a window, and then another. In moments, her home was in flames, and the disheveled crowd looked on, transfixed as the hut joined Dendled as a pillar of smoke. As the townspeople began to chant Grail's oaths, Sule crept back from the shed, and she turned, and then she froze. An old woman stood before her, and in her shaking hands, a crossbow was leveled at Sule's face. "You," said the woman. It was the baker lady. Sule had known her since she was small, Miss Radwell. Sule watched the sway of the metal bolt. She watched the woman's brow as it crinkled in hesitation. "We should never have let you stay," murmured Mrs. Radwell. "Should have told the city guard. Oh, oh my. They killed him, they killed my husband. And it's your fault. It's your fault, isn't it?" Miss Radwell's eyes hardened. You devil. You killed them." "I didn't," said Sule quietly. "Don't lie," said the old woman. "I can see your face. You're different. I can see you're different. Something vile beneath the surface. Your true face, Nornling." "Find something, Nana," a man called. "Aye, the devil girls." For a moment, Miss Radwell's face moved to the side and the bolt lowered. Sule ran, and there was a thwack as something whistled past her head. But she wasn't at all thinking about the stinging pain that blossomed on her ear. She was only interested in the rocks at the edge of the clearing. The yells of surprise and anger followed behind Sule. And while she was fast and she knew the hills, there were those who were faster, and those who knew the hills just as well as her. The bob of torches in the golden light, the smell of burning fields and the fires bright, the yells of rage and the burn of needle cuts from sharp leaves as the mob hunted her, following behind her in a furious wake. They wanted someone to blame. They were right to, Sule thought as she landed on all fours, sprinting to leap down a narrow path. If she and Ansel hadn't been here, it never would have happened. For a moment she thought about turning back to let them shoot her. It would certainly simplify things. Over boulders and sliding down gravel hillsides, Sule ran to an old grove of berry bushes nestled in a ravine. The bushes looped around themselves, the gaps between their roots large enough to crawl through. And that's what she'd done when she was a little girl, when she'd crawled through them with delight. But now there was only terror. Sule arrived at the hidden place. It was smaller than she remembered, and more overgrown, and she stopped there in the open and the creeping mist, breaths burning from her throat. Brambles and leaves formed a wall broken by the tunnels formed by countless animals and children. She listened for the sounds of her pursuers, her own footfalls quiet on the floor of rotting autumn leaves. She could still hear their shouts, if only just. The rest of the world felt far away here. Sule? Her breath caught in her throat. Sule spun, freeing Ansel's dagger from its sheath. The apparition stood behind her, cloaked in the mist. "Oliver?" she asked. Oliver's form emerged from the white like a ghost. His clothes were smeared with soot and one arm was badly burned. He looked thinner, and there were dark circles beneath his eyes. "You're real? You remembered this place?" "I didn't know where else to go," said Oliver. "Not after they burned." "Who?" Sule asked, lowering her dagger. "Everyone." She took a step forward, and Oliver took a step back, his eyes wide with fear. "You shouldn't have come back," said Oliver. Sule hesitated. She was certainly under that impression, but she still asked the question. "Why not?" "The man in the ship, before the fire fell, he said it was you. You and your pa." Sule felt like ice had run down her back. He said that you were a heretic, a devil, a demon, that we had served you instead of Grail." "That's not true," Sule whispered. She shrank back, seeing the rage rise in Oliver's face. He said the Lord ordered it, Oliver yelled. We should never have let you stay. My family is dead because of you. You're a liar, a cheat, and a thief. The voices of the mob were getting louder. There were shouts from outside the thicket. They'd heard him shouting. No, not Oliver, too. Emotions welled in her. Tears of frustration blurred her vision, and she wiped them away. Sule could smell smoke. You're going to run away? No, you're not going to run away. You need to pay, shouted Oliver, stepping towards her. You killed Jedam. You killed everyone. Dadden was right to call you a leech. Stop it, yelled Sule, and she turned and ran for one of the paths. But Oliver collided with her and she fell. Sule kicked and tried to roll. Fingers pried at the knife in her hands as Oliver went for her dagger. Without thinking, she twisted it around. Hot red blood splattered on her cheek, and Oliver cried out, and she was free, and she backed away, the blade held in front of her face. Oliver watched her, hunched forwards, cradling his wounded arm as flames leapt up from the brambles behind him. There was a resigned hatred written on his face, and the firelight reflected in his eyes. You did this, he said. The hound watched the girl flee back across the plain, torches bobbing behind her like angry fireflies. She didn't waste time, said Jesper. Like I said, said Olna, her position is clear to her now. She will learn to hide. What do you think he will do when he realizes? Said Jesper. This world, I fear, does not have long, said Olna. A shame, said Jesper. Glowing eyes watched a building brush fire carve its way like a great scar across the land. She's going the wrong way, said Jesper. The cat sighed. Chapter 4. Big Dansy. The shattered worlds are remnants of the once great house Durrell, Sidus, Toldrum, Blackfan, Suoa, Nuora, Inclasio, now largely controlled by pirates and the odd demigod. It's nothing more than an infamous backwater. The worlds are either truly shattered or stripped of life. Only the most insignificant and relatively independent planets remain untouched by the Empire's armies. Calfrophos, Antiquities Trader, year 42,423,997. A line of animals walked methodically along the side of a ravine, their sides laden with sacks of sloshing brine from thek and fish, draped in the bright pastel colors of patterned cloth. A dark contrast against the landscape as the sun shone in beams through burgeoning clouds. The animals were hairless, their bulbous folds of sagging skin carried on trunk-like legs. They snorted through nostrils positioned at the top of their blocky snouts, which were covered in long white whiskers. They looked like they were in the midst of melting. Their small black eyes watched the grassy ground ahead. From deep below in the depths of the ravine, the dull roar of water carried over the caravan, formed as the animals, known by their common name as Uba, found each other on their journey, as the nomadic caravaneers of Toldrum often did. A man wearing dark spectacles raised his hand, and the procession of animals snorted as they came to a halt. Sule stumbled out into the open path, waving her arm. One caravaneer cried out, making the sign of the gods to ward off evil spirits. Sule realized she was still covered in ash, caked mud and blood. She wiped at her face, then realized she was probably making it worse. Vas diabdalia stave dakne, said the man. Are you a lost spirit from the wastes? Ke shodak juma omvak citiom, said Sule. 'No, I need a ride to the city.' Dalna ne, gomzike ne, noslanlone, gritsha shovaksalne. Why alone? Trouble to know? Why bloodied? Greta asks. Are you a spirit girl stealing souls? Sule hesitated. There were robbers in the hills, she stuttered. I was going to see my pa in the city. They took my things. I was separated. The blood isn't mine. Someone was killed and fell on me. They thought I was dead. They left. The lie was fast, but it wasn't unheard of in these parts for travelers to be preyed on when they ventured off the main roads. Rare, but not unheard of. It's foolish to travel these hills alone. You're lucky to be alive. Have you nothing? There is a village here to the east. He pointed back towards Dendald. You can go there. Please, sir, I came from that way. That's where the bandits were going. Nobody is left from my... Please, I don't know what I'll do if you don't help me. I need to get to the city. Sule's eyes watered, and the tears came, but she felt like she was far away. It was another lie, but also a truth. She felt herself slipping into character, adjusting little truths into more fitting little lies, moving them around in her head until she started to believe them herself. You aren't Sule, she told herself. You're Lily from the town, gone to see her relatives in the city. She was surprised how easy it was. Lily didn't have her problems. Lily still had a family. The man took off his spectacles, polishing them on his cloak. His eyes were small and shrewd as he examined her. That smoke over the hill, from your bandits' campfire, is it? Sule's heart hammered against her ribs. I don't know. I just ran. You ran east, he observed, gesturing with his thumb back toward the trail. And now you want to go west to the city. He paused, letting the silence hang. Hush, had she? She hadn't even noticed. What's your name, girl? Lily, she choked out. My name's Lily. The man looked at her tattered clothes, the blood stains, her face. Well, Lily, Anasakwa told me the city guard is turning people inside out looking for trouble. A girl with no name, no papers as I imagine, and a bad story won't last an hour, let alone get past the gates. He chuckled and leaned forward slightly. But a girl who can keep the chief entertained on a long journey, now that's a different story. Sule gulped. You know how to play Sendak? Riding on the back of one of the lumbering creatures inside a tented platform, Sule took a swig of water. She'd cleaned off most of the grime and tended to her cuts and bruises as curious little caravaneer girls watched and giggled. She was some level of presentable now. She steepled her fingers, gazing attentively at the checkered board, sweat shining on her brow beneath her hair, which was now someone else's mess of sandy blonde. She still wasn't sure what to think. She was doing her best not to think at all. Even as the uba swayed with each step, the game pieces on the board remained level. Somewhere beneath her feet, a mechanism desperately in need of an oiling squeaked in protest. Sule reached out, touching the top of a white piece that sloped into his four-winged bird. She hesitated, then moved to an occupied square, replacing a two-headed king. She looked up at the chieftain as he raised his eyebrows above his dark spectacles. He was called Dansy, the big chief. Sule had started inwardly to refer to him as Big Dansy. You don't talk much, do you? Said Big Dansy. Sule shook her head. They had an audience, a crowd of giggling young'uns and caravaneers from the other ubas. They pressed in closer with exclamations as Sule took the marked metal sticks and tossed them into a cup. Big Dansy took it and shook, rolling them out across the board. The pieces always seemed to land exactly the way she wanted them to, Yet she still found herself surprised when they rolled into place. There was a roar of exclamation from the crowd, and Big Dansy shook his head in wonder. "You have the luck of the gods, girl," said Big Dansy, and pushed a pile of coins to Sule. "Not really," she muttered. She'd used up all her bad luck in the past day, it seemed. She sniffed and rubbed her nose. She took the single dunny she'd used at the start and pushed it back across the table. She'd won every game so far. Why not the next one, too? A dozen shouts as hands pressed forwards with coins of their own. "No, thank you," said Big Dansy with a frown. "My purse is nearly empty, and I have to leave some for the wives." Sule drew a hand to her chest theatrically, doing her best to look hurt, like Lily would have done. "Mr. Dansy, are you scared you'll lose?" she said with mock surprise. "Go on, game's over," said Big Dansy irritably. "Back to your mounts, the lot of you." He parted the canvas, and Sule saw the shadows had returned and the sky was a rosy pink. They'd been playing for most of the day. They were passing a rock formation that looked like two mossy saucers. Big Dansy let loose a whistle, and the line of ubas snorted and slowly lowered themselves to the ground. "The day grows long," he said. "We set camp here." For a second night, sleep still eluded Sule. When she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of the dead, of rotting corpses. Once she was sure she saw Oliver standing in the grass, watching her, a knife in hand. She tossed and turned and groaned, and would sit up searching the darkness, looking for masked figures. She'd run for days before finding the caravan. She'd stopped, staying a night at the base of an outcropping of stone near to Dendold, watching the mists for the villagers between the gnarled tree trunks and sodden moss. They'd still searched for her, torches hovering in white twisted fingers, bobbing like spirits as they'd passed. She'd covered herself in the moss and stuck the ferns into her clothes, sinking back into bushes and darkness, laying perfectly still until they passed. Sule must have fallen asleep at some point, because she dreamed in a feverish haze that she was back in the place but where she died, standing alone in the white desert. This time there were no ravens, and there was no tree, but she could still see the tops of its ancient roots peeking through the sand between the bodies. It was a field of bodies, a field of red that stained the white sand and spread until the sky was blood. She could still just as clearly visualize the tree beneath the battlefield, beneath the ground, its branches the roots, growing beneath her feet. Its fruit was the horror before her. The city of Vaslada loomed in the distance. Usually Sule would simply call it the city, and it was the only city she'd ever visited. As the caravan approached, the streets curved up above the plain, giving the city the impression of a giant anthill. A few ships coasted away from the starport, nestled somewhere inside the city walls. There was a line of people at the gates, their carts and wagons filled with goods. At the front of the line were soldiers. She could see they were checking papers, and her mind began to race. She didn't have any papers, as Big Dansy had already guessed. She was a Nornling, and Nornlings weren't allowed to be citizens of any house. The few times she'd snuck in with Oliver, there hadn't been anyone checking. Big Dansy watched the guards with a frown. "Bad luck, this business with the Empire," he said. "People get scared. Scared people mean empty markets. I see the ship is gone. At least the absence of its shadow will improve the mood." Sule was silent, and she could feel Big Dansy turn to study her. "I'll go," said Sule in resignation. "They won't let me in." "Ah," said Big Dansy. She moved to the door and kicked her legs over the edge of the harness, dropping into the mud. There was a snort behind her as the Uba stopped. "You're a terrible liar," called Big Dansy. "Whatever happened out in those hills, I could never guess. But it doesn't matter. I know what you are. Sule stared, tensing as she prepared to run. A poor girl out on her luck. Lose your parents to sick. How long have you been on your own? Big Dansy dismounted and moved to stand in front of her. Believe me, I've been out of my luck too. He patted Sule's cloak, and her coin purse rattled on her belt. She could feel her face grow hot. Not exactly right, but close enough. Come now, said Big Dansy. Fair is fair. He held out his hand. Sule watched his open palm with resignation, and then slowly took the coin purse and handed it over. If it's into the city you want, then it's into the city you'll get, said Big Dansy, as the coins disappeared into his cloak, and then his face split into a wide smile. The Uba trudged up to the guards, who watched the chief wearily as he pulled on the reins. The guards were dressed in brown, with hints of silver chrome armor plates shimmering between the folds of their uniform. The rifles they carried were long and dark, each barrel ending in the sinister point of a bayonet. Sule grimaced. She was pressed beneath the shifting harness, the Uba's belly smooth against her back. She peered out through a crack in the opening for the animal's leg, bars of light and shadow cast across her face. Sule thought they looked bored. She knew they'd already caught who they were looking for after all. But then why bother to check? State your business and duration of visit, said the first guard. Big Dansy mumbled something and handed over a handful of booklets. As the first guard began to leaf through the pages, the second walked in a circle, peering inside the canopy. For a moment he seemed to look right at her, pausing for a moment. Sule's breath caught in her throat. Then Big Dansy said something, and the guard chuckled, shaking his head, moving on to the next Uba in the line. They were waved through. Sule let her breath out and closed her eyes. The caravan came to a halt on a busy thoroughfare. Big Dansy helped her out from beneath the harness, and Sule looked up in awe at the great red stone arches that curved above them, speckled with slotted windows, at the multitudes of rushing people passing by with their carts and carriages. Men smoking hookah outside a worn-down cafe watched the caravan with a disinterested gaze. Everything in Vaslada was dirty and a bit run down. Shuttered buildings were mixed among homes. It was difficult to tell what was abandoned and what was occupied, but it was all still grand for someone like her. I know a place you can stay, said Big Dansy as he unlatched one of the thick pouches, carrying it to a growing pile. Gladia's Ostello, he said. You can trust her. Not like most places around here. They'll piss in your shoes and make you pay to have them cleaned. He gave her the directions and handed her a few dunnies. She thanked him, adding them to the ones she'd already palmed from the coin purse. She hesitated after crossing the street, confused as she looked back. Careful, called Big Dansy. Remember, you asked for this. Vaslada is its own beast. Don't sleep on the streets, and don't trust anyone. If you need anything, it costs extra, said Gladia, tapping a cigarette out the window. No friends allowed. Gladia turned and gave her an eye. Then she peered closer, getting right up in Sule's face. Could have sworn your eyes were green, not brown, she said, then shook her head, cursing to herself about old age and rotting minds. Sule touched her face, looking for her reflection in the glass to reassure herself it was the same. She was herself now, perhaps still a bit older. Beyond that, only the stranger's hair remained. Whatever had happened was fading from her features like a bad memory. The room was cramped, with 6 hammocks suspended from hooks in the ceiling. Someone snored, their bare feet and gnarled toenails rocking gently back and forth. Sule watched the feet warily, keeping her distance as she drove her way between the hammocks, stopping where a single window stood open. She pulled herself onto the flat of the windowsill and watched the travelers and city folk rush past below, their carts and animals rattling and clanking. 3 men laughed in a corner of the room. One was waving about a bottle, trying to get the others to drink it. "It's the special brew," said the man with the round face and sagging jowls. "No, no, no, no," said the other. He was tall with dark hair. His skin was deeply tanned. He was probably from one of the sun-spilt provinces in the south. "It's so bad." "You're the one who bought it. You finish," said the third. He slurred his words. "Give it to the cat," said the tan man. Sule watched as the round, fluffy face of the black fur peered around a beam to stare at her with its golden eyes. "Give it to her. Maybe she likes it," said the round one. The man pulled out a cup and poured it. At first the bottle seemed empty, and then a thick brown sludge bubbled into the cup. He offered it to the cat, who sniffed it and then hissed, and then he offered it to Sule as she approached cautiously. "Mmm," they exclaimed. She was handed the cup, and the 3 men broke into hysterics. Sule smelled it, and they laughed harder. She thought it didn't actually smell that bad at all. She tossed back the glass, drinking it all in one go, and the laughing stopped. "Thanks," said Sule, returning to her window ledge. She leaned back. She was exhausted. She hadn't slept at all during the ride, or the night before, or the night before that. She looked over at the group of men eyeing the bottle. Should she fall asleep? She didn't really care. There was a disconnect. Some part of her was missing. It didn't feel real. She didn't feel real. She remembered her own dead eyes. Was she the same person? Or did she only think that she was? Chapter 5. Sophie and the Starships. Gods cannot be killed by mortal hands, except by the true king of all gods and mortal men, Grail, and his power pure. So did he use his power to cleanse the god of corruption, Loka, of heresy and lies, saving our peace, saving our souls, before he could steal them for himself. High Seer Wola of the Rose, year 42,423,998. The crisp morning air smelled faintly of wet grass and the spice of ground mondo. The shopkeepers had just begun to open their shutters. The few who passed Gladia's doorway were dressed in the white robes of the Dalcadia, on their way to the morning communion. As Sule began to follow them, she passed a group of street urchins with their dirty faces and ragged clothes. They eyed her as she passed, perhaps wondering why one of their own was following the procession. Sule poked a finger through the hole in the front of her cloak, the same hole from which Yorick had stabbed her in the heart. She'd never get anywhere respectable looking like this. As Sule passed a stall, she grabbed a drab canvas coat, while the shopkeeper was distracted setting up his wares, throwing it around her shoulders as she continued deeper into the city. Sule was eventually led towards a structure that towered over the neighboring buildings. It was formed from the smooth black stone that every temple was built from. Familiar golden imagery was inlaid on every surface. The floors were red and carpeted. She passed the 3 statues of the guardians shading the entrance into the expansive room, and was met by the great faces of the 8 gods of the 8 founding worlds, carved from the same black stone. But the head of the 9th was noticeably absent. The statue of Loka remained, but the head had been shorn off at the shoulders. The 8 just doesn't have the same ring to it, thought Sule. The entire central pillar was dedicated to a single figure, looking upwards into the beam of sunlight. His bearded face looked wise and contemplative. His mouth was parted slightly, like he was about to speak. Thousands of smaller heads covered the remaining walls in little nodules, representing the minor gods. Some gods were associated with death and destruction, while others, life, fertility, and beauty. Sule knelt on the floor and prayed with the others. there was a grounding comfort that came with the action. She found it dulled the pain. It was like she was floating in a pool of perfect water. It almost felt like, for a moment, she could belong to something bigger. She stayed until most of the others had left. "Does something trouble you, child?" A woman in white robes stood beside her. The temple Delcat, one of the royal priests, a mouthpiece of the gods. The village temple had no clergy that were ranked so highly. Sule stared in awe and fell back to her knees. "Blessed be the hand that stays," Sule mumbled quickly. Emotion welled up inside her. "Maybe." "You may speak," said the Delcat. I've lost everything," said Sule after a moment. Her eyes watered as the Delcat looked down at her. "My grandpa, my whole family, please, tell me what to do." "You need to trust in the light of the eight and pray," said the Delcat. "Only through true belief and in subservience do we receive the love of Krail. He will light your way. How did this loss happen, child?" Sue looked up at the Delcat, and then at the faces of the gods. There was a pain, like something was digging between her eyes, twisting in her head under the glare of the statues. Sule grimaced, her vision swimming as her ears popped. She groaned and touched her nose, and her finger came away red. "Are you well, child?" said the Delcat, looking at her with concern. When Sule's eyes refocused, she realized that the statues behind the Delcat had changed. No longer were they expressions comforting. No longer did they radiate warmth, but cruel emptiness. And Sule shivered as she wondered if the chill had always been there. "Child," repeated the Delcat. Then her eyes became vacant. For a moment the Delcat stood perfectly still. A barely perceptible tremor ran through her hand. "I'm sorry, said Sule as she clambered to her feet. She trailed off as she realized the Delcat's expression had transformed into something more akin to feverish zealotry. Then her eyes refocused on Sule. He told of one." The woman grabbed Sule's chin and jerked her face up. Then her eyes widened. "She shall be in the skin of a lost daughter." The woman parted Sule's stolen coat so that she could see the stained one beneath. "And she shall be cast in bloodied rags." Sule scrambled back as the woman lunged for her. Sule remembered at that moment the voice in her dream. "What are you?" Then she found her feet were sprinting for the exit. Sule blinked as she ran. The Greys served the gods, the Dalcatia served the gods, and the gods wanted her dead. What was she thinking? She wasn't, obviously. "Seal the doors! The girl is not to leave this temple!" cried the Delcat from behind her. The two temple guards at the entrance, massive men in polished armor, moved as one. They slammed the great ebony doors shut with a boom, a durwood bar dropping with a metallic thud, locking it in place. The guards closed in from all sides. Sule skidded to a halt and lunged over a bench, sprinting towards an unadorned wooden door set in the back, a sliver of light at its base. She prayed it was unlocked. A hand tingled violently in her hair from behind, yanking her head back with incredible force, and slammed her to the ground as she cried out. "You would violate the Lord's command!" the Delcat hissed in her ear. "A devil!" Sule's hand flew to her belt, her hands closing around the hilt of Ansel's dagger. She wrenched it free and in a single clumsy, terrified motion, drove it back along her side. The blade struck something soft. The Delcat cried out, and her grip vanished. Sule sprinted, her feet slapping against the stone, the dagger still clutched in her hand, except now it was stained. She'd stabbed a priest. Oh, Navasu, forgive her. Sule slid across the polished floor, passing beneath the blade of a sword. She crashed through the door, her feet splashing into puddled mud, running from the shouts as she was again drenched by rain-slicked air of a narrow alleyway. "Stop!" yelled one of the temple guards, close on her heels. There were 6 now. "By order of the Delcatia!" She turned and turned again, running down the streets. Passerby in oilskin cloaks turned their heads to watch, but doing nothing to help the Nornling girl. There were more soldiers in front of her when she turned down a narrow road. She turned back, only to see her pursuers round the corner. Sule dove down an alley. The soldiers yelled, and a hand came out of the shadows and grabbed her. A second covering her mouth, pulling her out of the street. A moment later, the soldiers ran past in a thunder of boots and clinking armor. Sule struggled against her captor's grasp. The hand over her mouth was like a Durwood vice. She stopped, her muffled protest fading. Only then did the hand lift away. "Old Gamby saved you. Oh, yes, he did," cracked the high-pitched voice of an old man. Sule turned to see old Gamby smile a crooked, toothless smile in the half-light. He put a finger to his lips. Sule eyed the old man as she backed away. He was thin, with wispy white hair, but through the wrinkles that nearly obscured his eyes there was kindness. Sule relaxed. He was a street dweller. Perhaps he had mistaken her for one of his. She turned and peered out through the cracks in the wood into the adjoining street. "We have to brand the entire city to be sure," growled a man in a grey cloak as his legs stormed into view. "The girl is one of the Nornlings the fools missed?" questioned another. "Leave no stone unturned. The message from the Dalcadia is clear. The girl is a Nornling heretic, which does not rule out an Alcuer. She should be considered armed and exceptionally dangerous. Failure is not an option. Tell the people there will be a significant reward for her capture. Alive." "Alive? Are you sure?" "It is of critical importance. I have my orders." "The entire city will take time." "We'll close it block by block, move section by section. See to it the gates are closed immediately." The soldiers lined up everyone in the street. They held a struggling woman while their leader grabbed the handle of a box. From within he pulled out a thin rod that glowed and simmered with a yellow heat. There was a hiss of burning as he pressed it into her flesh. The woman screamed. They dropped her, and the man shook his head. He continued down the line, branding each person in turn. "What are they looking for?" whispered Sule. "Algors," muttered the old man. "Their skin like metal. Can't burns a wizard." Old Gamby pointed to the officer. "There's one in Algor," he said. "His pins. Don't burn nada." Sule looked more closely at the man holding the burning rod, and then realized with a start that there was no handle. They can't be burned. Sule thought back to the lightning and the heat she'd felt on her face, and she imagined how much worse it would have been if she'd been closer. They'd have to be fireproof to survive that. The Greys didn't find their Alcuer, and continued on. Slowly people began to collect themselves and began to go about their lives as if nothing had happened. When the bustle of the street had resumed, Sule stepped back into the light to face her savior. "Thank you," she started to say, but old Gamby had left, and she heard him cackling madly as she caught sight of the man rushing down the alley. "Very much." A sodden mass of fur brushed against her leg, and then stared up at her from a black void with familiar golden eyes, looking bug-eyed on its wet but still sizable frame. "Hey," said Sule, kneeling down. "You're the one from the inn, aren't you? Did you follow me?" "Meow," said the cat, its eyes closing and opening in greeting. "Do you have any idea where I should go?" she asked the thunderously purring feline as she stroked its back. "Meow," said the cat, and waddled off between the feet of the crowd. With a shrug, Sule followed. Large docks formed a partially floating latticework of silvery repulsion silk, and connecting piers suspended above the streets. Between the spiderweb, rising towards the sky and along the ground, were dozens of ships. They hung in the air side by side, suspended by their own repulsion silks attached to the masts that hung along the sides of their hulls. The droplets of water could be seen bending about them, flowing along invisible lines. The cat continued on down the street, its paws moving with a purpose. She followed the runic signs for passenger until she found herself walking down a way with ships along either side. Signs were haphazardly posted on each dock, listing the port of call and their destination. She looked for the rose, but couldn't find it. She caught sight of the cat again, waddling between two ships. She thought to continue after it, but found herself stopping at the foot of a ship's gangway. There was a woman there, sitting on a chair as she sketched on a pad. "Well, wouldn't hurt to check," murmured Sule. Sule peered up at the ship doubtfully. The hull sloped down into a hollow depression, and then up into a lengthy bowsprit. The wheelhouse and parts of the deck were only partially enclosed. The center of the deck was covered by a thick canvas. Cozy lights cut through the dreariness with a welcoming glow. The durawood reflected with a dark, steely tone. It did not shine per se, nor was it colorful, as many of the vessels floating about were. Yet it had a certain functional elegance to it. But calling it elegant was stretching it. Perhaps antiquated was the right word. "She's space-worthy," said the woman, without looking up as she continued. "The Sophie may look old like me, but she's still got a spring in her step." Water fell around the woman in little waterfalls, but in the shadow of the hull she was as dry as could be. Her charcoal flew over the canvas with a practiced ease. The woman looked up for a moment, setting the picture aside. Her gaze was intense, like a searchlight. "Which world you headed?" The woman tapped her right cheek. "The name's Jun." Jun's hair was streaked with gray, and her wrinkled face was covered in deep, hard lines. Her skin was a pale red, some outer mix and not entirely human. Sule noted the gun holstered to her belt. "Well?" "The rose?" said Sule hesitantly. "That's a city, dear, not a world, and no, we're not going there." John pulled out a pipe and puffed on it, blowing out a cloud of rainbow smoke as she went back to drawing. "Sorry to bother you," mumbled Sule, turning to go. "Funny you ask, though. Can you pay? It's 50 pow," said June. "What?" said Sule. I thought you—" "Guarantee nobody else is going anywhere close," said June. "Rose is too far. Nobody is direct. But we'll end up there eventually. You'd be the second passenger we're heading that way. We're about to head out too, so best be making up your mind." Sule silently thanked the cat. Sule felt around in her coin purse and frowned as she felt how little was left. She emptied the remaining contents into her hand. "Is this enough?" She held out her pitiful handful of dunnies. Jun eyed the coins. "What's your name?" said Jun, scooping the dunnies from her palm. "Lily," said Sule. "No family name? Why are you going to the Rose?" Sule saw a sign behind the Sophie, above a shady derelict building. It read, "Morgan's Gate. Come sin." "Moorgate," said Sule. "Lily Moorgate. Just going to see my family." "Long way from family, Miss Moorgate. And this isn't enough," said June. "You're short 20 pow." "Good. You don't want that one as a passenger," said a voice from behind her. The voice belonged to a slim-faced man wearing a mustache and a tailored clothes. She recognized the expression on his face and immediately knew what he would say next. "Look at her," said the man. "She's a Nordling, and a wilder girl, too. You can tell by the way she speaks, that dreadful lilt. Doubly so. Those Parklanders are like savages of this world. Unpredictable, dangerous. She'll rob you blind. Mark my words." Sule frowned. He hadn't referred to her as an it, at least. The man was probably royalty from some caste that hadn't been enforced for 100 years. Which caste, though, is always hard to tell. She'd never memorized them all. There was always new ones being added. The only one that mattered was hers, on the bottom. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Wilton." Jen seemed to make up her mind about something and then swept Sule's money into her bag. "Actually, I miscounted," she said. "This is enough." Sule did a double take. "What?" cried Wilton. This is outrageous. I won't have one of them on a ship for which I am a passenger. It's unclean. I won't stand for it." "Guess you'll have to find a different ship," said June. "But I've already paid 200 dunny. This is preposterous," sputtered Wilton. A second man appeared behind Wilton. He had dark brown skin, and his black beard was speckled with gray, framing a wide nose. His cloak swept out behind him, and he was also wearing a gun, a long revolver of black metal that glinted in the light. He was exactly how Sule would have imagined a starship captain to look. "Problem?" said the man. "Nice of you to join us, Captain," said June. "The gentleman here is complaining about the status of our new passenger." "Status?" The captain eyed Sule, looking her up and down. "She's annoying," snapped Wilton. "And a wielder," he said again when the captain had no reaction, sounding like it was making him sick. "If she wasn't so old, I'd say she was an urchin, but no." Then in a more conspiratorial tone, "She's probably graduated to whore. Listen, Reginald, was it? You seem like a reasonable man." Reginald just looked at him. "She's unclean," said Wilton. "She looks clean enough to me," said Reginald. "I've paid," said Wilton. "Does appear that way," said Reginald. "So did she." "You can't do this. This is robbery. You are seriously considering—" "No, I'm getting the portmaster. You are thieves." "We are nothing of the kind, Mr. Wilton," said the captain. "Mr. Wilton, we are spacers, and we have no set rates. You are a paying passenger. You may move your belongings onto the ship, and we will fly you to your destination. That is all." Reginald turned and walked up the gangplank, disappearing into the ship. He reappeared a moment later, his finger tapping the air like he just remembered something. "No refunds," he said, more to June than Wilton. Then he vanished again. "Come along, Lily," said June, picking up her chair and drawing pad and heading up the gangway. Sule tried and failed to hold in a smug smile, and she found particular pleasure in watching Wilton's jaw work. He looked between the portmaster's tower and the gangway, and after a moment he cursed and began to drag up his luggage. The deck of the Sophie was cluttered with nets, thrown over what looked like to be a range of chairs of the garden variety, and small statues of little round men with chubby cheeks and red-pointed caps. "We'll be going shortly," said June. "Captain just has to make some final arrangements." They passed a young man in the corridor. His hair was a mess of dark curls. He could have been the captain's son. His hands were buried in an exposed panel, tightening something inside. He looked up at her, and for a moment they locked eyes, and her breath caught in her throat. He was gorgeous, maybe 2 years older, with smooth light brown skin. He had a kind of rugged handsomeness of a spacer, and with those dark, dreamy eyes. "Ben?" said Jun, nodding a greeting. "Jun," said Ben. "New passenger?" "Sule will be your helping hand for the voyage," said Jun. "I know you've been asking for one." Sule opened her mouth. "Oh, yeah?" said Ben. "You know a lot about starships? Can you fix a sap manifold?" Sule tried to think of something smart to say. I can open doors. No, gods, what? I mean, I'm good with locks." "Lily is a fast learner," said Joan, patting Ben's shoulder as he tightened his lips and continued to look straight ahead as they passed. "She'll pick up what she needs to." Joan led her deeper into the ship, through Durwood corridors lined with pipes and oil flame lamps. Some pipes had rows of little valves that spit thin streams of steam, their tops opening and closing like the caps of small tea kettles. She hesitated at one as it opened and filled the corridor with a white cloud, but Jun walked right through. "Come on. As long as you touch nothing you shouldn't. The Sophie's the safest girl in the deep." Sule followed a moment later. The steam was hot, but not scalding. This is it, said June. She opened a door, revealing a tiny, narrow room with a single hammock. There was a little table next to the porthole, which Sule walked to and stared out at the street below. It's small, but you get what you pay for, said June. It'll be yours for the month. A month? Said Sule. She turned in surprise. June didn't seem to understand how perfect this was. She never actually had her own room. Rose ain't close, said June, her eyes crinkling. I did you a favor today. I expect you to work and to work hard. This isn't some fairy tale ride. Don't make me regret bringing you on. You have papers? Sule shook her head. That's what I thought. You owe me double time. If the dock authority checks, make sure you're out of sight. I'll show you where to go later. I might even teach you how to draw if you'd like that. Sule nodded. Settle in. You missed breakfast, but there'll be dinner. Take a tour if you like. Don't touch anything. Come up top when you're ready. Sule spent a time in the cabin before she found her way to the cargo hold. Reginald, the captain, was there, and he was in a heated discussion with a group of outers that didn't look friendly in the slightest. She ducked behind a row of crates before they noticed her, and peered between them from the shadows, the outers' voices carrying from the top of the gangway. Grace said the pickup would be here, said Reginald. Plans changed, said one of the outers. He had ears like a bat, and when he smiled she could see his teeth ended in points. If you want to make the delivery, then you go to the source on Blackfan, or no deal. I didn't agree to this, said Reginald. Grace wants the product, said another one of the outers. This one with a hard orange skin and pale eyes. You deliver, otherwise nobody's happy. We all lose, eh? Sule tensed, waiting to see what Reginald would do. Lighten up, Reg, said the one with the bat ears. Remember, he's giving you one last shot. You get the worms, you make the payment. Life goes on. But remember, you're an old man now. Word on the street is you've lost your spunk. My bet is, you don't do this. Things don't go well down the road. Maybe Crace doesn't stay with you. Maybe life doesn't either. You hear? Get off my ship, growled Reginald. Right, said Bad Ears, giving one final toothy grin, waving for the goons to follow him as they walked back down the gangway. Your ship. They sauntered out of sight. Reginald pinched the bridge of his nose and then walked past Sule, stopping for a moment at the door. He looked away and she ducked. Then she heard him keep walking, his footfalls receding into the distance. Who was Crace and what were the worms? Sule watched the crew as they scurried about the masts, squinting through the torrential rain and gloom. There was another young man with long brown hair helping Ben, and a woman who might have been his sister. Reginald stood outside the open door, and June watched over the activities behind the glass. An outer with 4 arms manned a double wheel, an intimidating array of levers and switches. She had no idea if it was male or female, or both. Its skin looked like a tortoise mite, folded and creased, and it was half the height of the others. Come on, put your backs into it, shouted Reginald over the downpour, having joined them in preparing the mast. Something has the Greys riled up, and I very much intend to be sky-side and off this hellhole before they figure out we ain't tied down. Masts rotated in a symphony of grinding gears, elongating and pulling outwards. Repulsion silk rippled and pulled taut along their length, cloaking the Sophie in silver. The wood creaked under a sudden strain as the fabric ballooned upwards. Ben led her to a winch. Keep turning until I tell you to stop, he said. Sule nodded, and Ben went back to pulling on a line, his arms rippling with the effort and making it look easy. You aren't pulling, said Ben, sounding irritated. Right. Sorry, said Sule, her cheeks growing hot. Unlike Ben, her arms could barely turn the handle. He had to come over and help her finish the motion. Like that. Sule pressed her lips into a line. I'm not clueless, you know, she said. Right, said Ben, looking over his shoulder, his dark hair a wet mat over his eyes. You can open doors. Sule's face burned, with very complicated locks. There was a horn from the shipyard, and Sule's stomach lurched as she looked over the railing and could see people looking up from below. She noticed grays in groups, closing in like a flood of mud on the starport from the city streets. Was it all for her? It didn't matter why, not anymore. They quickly became the size of ants. They would have been searched if it had been a moment longer. But she had a feeling this particular crew wouldn't have liked that any more than she would have. The ship was rising slowly at first as the sails continued to unfurl, and then they began to gain speed. There was a heaviness to her feet as the domes of the spire in the city temple, for which she thought there could be nothing taller, rushed past in a blur as they fell away below. They were in a cloud. Lightning and thunder boomed, and the rain was a monsoon. The masts creaked and groaned to the point where she feared they would snap. The wind whipped her clothes into a frenzy and made her eyes water. She clutched at a pillar for support, afraid to let go. The ship shuddered as it punched through the last layer of storm clouds. The roar of wind and rain vanished. The sudden silence was more deafening than the thunder. They soared, leaving thin trails of cloud vapor behind as they shot above the planet. Sunlight, harsh and unfiltered, flooded the deck, warming her face. Below the world she had known, her entire existence was a swirling canvas of white and green. "Drive primed, Captain," called the outer from the pilot house. Then the sails began to ripple and snap about. "Let's throw some wood on the fire," said Reginald. There was a vibration deep within the belly of the ship, a chuttering thrum that rose in volume. The heaviness returned and the sails pulled taut. There were so many sails. It was as if the Sophie itself had become suspended in a shining cloud. What remained of the sky was beauty outlined by the deepest black, a rich tapestry of mixing everclouds of every imaginable color, the speckling of millions of distant stars and the faint outlines of nearby planets. "I remember the first time I saw it," said June as she joined them on the deck. "It was far from here. A brighter star, and very hot." "It's beautiful," whispered Sule. "There's always a certain danger that comes with beauty," said Joan wistfully. "Like a poisonous animal. Out here in the dark, if you're not careful, something beautiful will gobble you up and spit out the bones." Sule was silent for a moment, watching the gas curl around the sails, and then her curiosity got the better of her. "Why can't we feel the wind like before?" she asked. "The silk pushes it away. It creates something like a tunnel around the ship. It's not perfect, obviously. Heavy gas. There's less of that." June looked her finger and held it up as a breeze tousled her gray locks. "You've never been off-world? Never breathed ether?" Sule shook her head. "It's different, but good," said June. She took a deep breath and let it out. "Nothing quite like it. Clears the head." Sule took a breath herself and nearly choked on it. It felt like drinking nothing. She hadn't noticed at first, but there was no effort in breathing it, like it wasn't really there. She couldn't feel it in her throat or her nose, yet her lungs were full. It smelled faintly like salt. She blew on her hand. She barely felt it. She blew harder. If anything, she felt it even less. "You'll get used to it," said June. "And if not—" She shrugged. On the ship flew, and Sule moved to sit in the pilot house, watching the outer steer the ship. The wheel was a complicated instrument. There was a left and a right movement, and an up and a down, and a tilt forwards and backwards, and that wasn't even including the levers and foot pedals. The outer sat in the seat, 4 arms and 4 legs, keeping check on every control simultaneously. "I'm Chorsk," said the outer. "Lily," she replied. "Pleasure to make your acquaintance," said Chorsk. "You want to try flying?" Chorsk flipped over about 30 different brass knobs and levers as he asked the question. Sule shook her head. "Ah, next time then," said Chorsk. She had only a minute more to watch Toldrum shrink to a small sphere, a pale green orb covered in swirls of white cloud, before June reappeared and shooed her back inside the stairwell. She was guided down a flight of stairs, and then June thrust a bucket and mop into her hands, and then opened a door into a small kitchen that was the filthiest she had ever seen. There were pots crusted with long-forgotten meals, and in the middle of it all, a heaping iron pot steamed lazily. "Clean," said June. Hours passed, and Sule mopped, and she scrubbed, and she scraped. A bell rang faintly, and the crew began to pile in. Ben grabbed a bowl from the stack that she had just cleaned. He threw open the pot and dished out a heaping spoonful of the stew with a ladle. Half of it spilled, splattering across the counter, and he didn't even so much as look twice. "The pretty boy's a slob," thought Sule. The man and the woman she had seen before rushed in, and in a few moments there was a small crowd. None of them were any cleaner than Ben. Sule waited until they had sat at the table, and then she served herself, sitting between Ben and Jun. Chorsk was at the far end of the table, eating something blue and doughy. Wilton made a brief appearance to retrieve his portion of the stew. She'd seen him sulking briefly on the deck, before he'd vanish again to his quarters. He saw her, and his eyes widened slightly before he made a small sound of disgust and rushed from the kitchen. The crew were looking at her with upturned eyes, greedily slurping their food. It had been days since she had a proper meal. Sule stuffed it into her mouth along with the others, savoring every bite. "Who's the new girl?" said a man with straight blonde hair and ink-drop eyes. He had angular features and high cheekbones, and he looked a bit haggard. He was probably a good 10 years younger than Reginald, but older than the others. As Sule watched, he uncorked a metal flask and took a swig. "Passenger," said Reginald through a mouthful of food. "I'm Miro, and this is my sister Rowan," said a young man that had been helping Ben on the deck. "She's the ship's doctor." "We're the Locks, twins if you haven't figured it out yet," said Rowan, tying her long brown hair back up into a bun. "For all the good that does us. I'm not a real doctor. I flunked out." "We're opposites," said Miro, nodding. "And that asshole," Rowan gestured at the man with blonde hair, "is Felix, the ship's engineer. He mostly stays to himself." Felix casually flipped her off, and Rowan snickered. "What do you think about the deep so far?" asked Miro. "I hate the deep," said Rowan, before Sule could open her mouth. "It's dark, filled with disease, poisonous plants, and monsters." "See, that's not fair," said Miro. "You're only looking at the bad things." "It's all bad," cried Rowan. "I'm only here because you're so dead set on getting off world, and I can't stand the thought of you melting to death somewhere with Gadarian blood fever. And I was right, you know. If I hadn't been there on Poonwa, you would have been killed by those damn flying eels." "That was one time," said Miro. "Hubarian pox on Kenterwall." "That was the flesh-eating grass on Pazzle." Okay, lay off." "So you trade furniture?" Sule asked. "There's a lot of money to be made in garden accessories," said Reginald in a tired way. "It's true," said Ben. "Adirondack chairs and high-quality gnomes. Cheap to build, but people will pay a fortune for them." Rowan snickered and then fell silent and stared at the floor when June glared at her. "Routes are few. We take what we can get," said June mildly. Reginald suddenly stood with a yell as something black bolted out from beneath the table. Chairs fell and screeched, and everyone scrambled for cover as Sule toppled backwards in fright. This was it. The end. A demon sent by the Empire had found her, and it was about to take back her stolen body. Reginald pulled his gun and tried to take aim, but the cat had already vanished through the door. "What in the devil?" he yelled. "What kind of vile pest?" "It's a cat, Reginald," said June. "What is a cat doing on my ship?" he shouted. "Could be helpful," said Felix. "You know, eat the vermin and all that." "Did you see it?" said Miro. "I'm pretty sure the only thing that cat is eating is lard." "I want it gone," said Reginald, holstering his gun, waving his finger between the crew. "If any of you see it, throw it off." "No," said Rowan, her mouth dropping open. "What kind of man are you?" "I mean it," said Reginald. "So, Lily, you've been quiet," said June. "I'm curious. You said your family on the Rose, was it?" She looked at Reginald. "Interesting place to meet someone. It's quite far." "My pa wanted me to go," said Sule, turning back from where the cat had disappeared through the door. She put down her spoon and did her best to form a smile. "He didn't come with you?" asked Rowan. "Where's your pa now?" Sule's face fell, and then Rowan's eyes widened. "Oh," said Rowan. There was a muttering of condolences. "He was sick for a while. It's fine." It wasn't, but they didn't need to know that. "I should take this time to say," said Reginald, "we'll be making one more stop before we leave the Shattered Reach. Then we'll head to Hadriar's world to restock." "Stop?" asked Chorsk, licking his fingers of blue goo. Sule already knew. "Black Fan," said Reginald. Rowan spit her soup across the table and started to cough. Miro patted her back. Evidently it wasn't a very nice place. She watched the crew bicker. She was flying into the unknown with a crew of strangers, and she was surrounded by people, but she had never felt more alone.